这一年当中，其实中国不断的告诉全世界，人民币要国际化，人民币要替代美元。但是我看那个范围越来越小。还有一个呢，现在很多的经济实力比较差的国家，类似阿根廷或这个土耳其这种，都跟中国去签双边换汇机制，大家在那边套利啊，套得很快乐。那这种情况呢，就是说中国的人行现在在做一个人事上的调动，这个调动呢，对中国在面对资产负债表的修补。今天我们听完演讲，罗伟先从这个角度来跟大家分享一下，好不好？
刚好就在这一个周末，那突然间传出一个消息，那就说现任的那人行的那党委书记郭树清以及副党委书记易纲，然后同时解职，然后由副行长，然后就潘功胜那接任党委书记。那预期的话，可能在某一个时间点，那就是说人行的行长就会由那潘功胜接任。那潘功胜他的主要的专长就在于说，那对于说外汇管制以及房地产控制方面，他有相当丰富这方面的经验。那所以我们预期说，过去那很长一段时间，那易纲一直在坚持不做大水漫灌，然后他跟财政部之间做了相当长一段时间的抗衡。或许是说，在未来人事调整之后，那中国的货币政策可能会有所调整。那这是就说，或许说这是他来解决问题的一个方法之一。
好，谢谢。我想另外一个要由我们李董事长来谈一下这一轮地缘政治当中，台湾的应对跟自处之道，你有什么样的建议？
像刚刚辜先生那里所提的，跟西方国家持续的这样子斗争的这种态势，它必然是衰败，这在历史上都不断的出现。而台湾呢，我想我们所能做的呢，当然短期间我们较为弱势，但长期间整个历史这一个经济的变化，其实对我们是有利的。那我们所能做的我想就是应该还是坚持和平、民主、人权。然后呢，在自己在经济上能维持一定量的这一个能量。而在过去几年，我觉得有一件事情做得很好，就在减降中国曝险，大幅的减降。在过去7年当中，台湾无论是金融的曝险或经济的曝险大幅减降，也改变了这一个竞争的态势，也强化了台湾的经济的力量，包括台商回来。中高阶的回到台湾，中低附加价值的到了这个东南亚、印度地区去。我想这一些呢，都是在让我们可以创造一个新的一个再平衡的趋势。谢谢。
好，回头我们要请李正仪博士来跟大家。昨天你也听了张忠谋的演讲所以你也回应一下。张忠谋先生昨天特别讲，他说国家安全重于地缘政治的比较利益的这种好处了你的心得跟大家分享一下了还有一个就是说，第二个要特别问你，香港7月1号回归26年了，现在在国安法通过之后，香港的整个调整，现在看起来，我想你注意香港很久了，也顺便把这个问题跟大家分享一下，这2个问题好不好？
事实上，我大概今年5月的时候呢，我去那个华盛顿 DC 就是 CSIS， 那我去那边语谈。那语谈什么呢？我是去语谈半导体因为其实那个绝大多数都是国际关系专家，因为他们要谈半导体，他们发现我们谈国际关系的人不太懂半导体，所以他们就找了一个这个像我们这种半吊子去那因为我是这个半导体的半吊子所以这个我们家董事长呢就非常紧张，他就觉得你去美国，结果去那边跟那个美国总统的这个特别助理谈半导体会不会丢脸我说他还特地帮我安排让我去拜访这个张创办人。那我就去跟他请教，他也问了很多他的问题那事实上，我去美国呢，我第一件事情我就跟这个美国的这个总统这个 Special Assistant 我就不好意思帮台湾讲话。我说你们说这个要台湾的这个半导体呢，要这个对美国要 keep transparency。我说 keep transparency to whom？ 你要对谁 keep transparency？ 你是说这个台积电要对美国政府 keep transparency 吗？要透明吗？那我问你一个问题：如果今天有任何的资讯泄密的话，是你美国政府要负责，还是台积电要负责？那个人不敢讲话。 对不对？我说我在问你一件事情，台积电去中国设厂，然后三星去西安设厂，设了10年20年，他们有没有 information leaking？ 没有。这个你们帮乌克兰打这个俄罗斯打了18个月，你们 information leaking 几次 ？Twitter 都跑出来了嘛，对不对？我说那如果到时候有出事，你们要负责吗？他也不敢讲话，很明显的啦。我觉得现在已经是就是有案外包。我在那个语坛的会场，其实我也对美国有一些批评啊。事实上，美国的这个情报总监去美国国会听证说，中国一旦对台湾动武啊，这个全世界的经济损失会超过6000亿到1兆美元。我说你这个数字根本是胡说八道的。为什么是胡说八道？台湾的 GDP 一年就是8000多亿，对不对 ？Apple 的晶片谁做的？都是台积电做的嘛。台积电如果挂了 ，Apple 会有手机吗？不会嘛。Apple 市值多少？3兆嘛。NVIDIA 市值多少？1兆嘛，对不对？而且我在讲嘛，现在美国的看法是，整个韩半岛跟台海的危机是连在一起的，一打就是全部混在一起打。所以安倍首相说什么？台湾有事就是，这个日本有事。菲律宾小马克思总统说，我跟你讲，我很难想象台湾海峡打仗，我们菲律宾会没事。如果真的全部打在一起的话，你觉得可能只有1兆美元吗？对不对？你知道中国18兆美元，如果打台湾只要1兆美元的 cost， 你这个不是鼓励中国犯台吗？其实我们觉得现在整个以前是成本导向，今天我要去投资，我去成本最低的地方投资，现在是市场导向。所以台积电要去美国，台积电要去欧洲，台积电要去日本，这个都是市场导向。这个某一个程度上，你说这个是好事还是坏事？这个当然也不是坏事啊，这个是你实力的展现嘛。你怎么我们的公司去国外投资是坏事情呢？那别人的公司来我们台湾投资，难道就变成好事了吗？那这个逻辑不太通嘛。所以我觉得呢，这个其实呢，这个趋势已经很明显了，就是说，这个可能美中之间呢关系呢，短期之内呢都很难变好。那另外是讲到香港嘛，我觉得香港呢其实是比较可惜的，但是我也不觉得中国大陆会很快把香港变成它的城市之一，会像上海一样，我觉得也不会，因为香港其实对于中国来说，它是一个非常重要去接海外资金的一个港口。我如果那么快就把香港收起来的话，其实这个对整个中国大陆经济发展是不好的。但是我觉得香港其实是一个比较可惜，一个蒙尘的明珠了。那还是需要一些法治化，香港才有办法回到以前的那个光亮，大概是这样子。
我都会再请教你一个问题，就是说，美国升息如果再往上升啊，对未来的世界经济到底会带来什么影响？
首先在美国的升息方面来讲的话，就是说7月大概会再升1码，就是说他点阵图宣布他要再调高的，从中位数从5.1调高到5.6，然后那紧接着那就是说公布了美国的经济数据，然后第一季那直接上修到2%，然后那上个星期五公布了核心 PCE 的年增率，那它也是微幅的上升到4.7，虽然说 MOM 的话从0.4下降到0.3，但是服务类的这一个年制性的话，会迫使到它必须要再采取一些行动。那所以说7月这一次升息很有可能会落实。但至于说9月到底会不会再升最后1码，那目前来讲还不是那么完全确定，因为就是说在于说整个后续的美国经济的前景，现阶段来讲至少到第3季应该没有多大的问题，但第4季之后的话，其实是存在着相当多的不确定性。所以说大概8月底的决策后的年会的话，那就是说可以观察那9月份或11月份有可能再做最后1码升息的一个可能性。那另外的话就是说，美国那大幅的升息，那10次升息，那总共20码的幅度之后，那接下来第11次升息，那升到那5.25%到5.5%，那其实对美国来讲的话，是造成相当程度的一个影响。今年的状况跟去年有点不一样，去年上半年初的时候，美国是薪资跟那物价之间呈现一个螺旋性的上扬，但是现阶段来讲，我们可以注意到， 大概在从去年的11月到12月左右，他们目前的那薪资的增长率，那就是说已经开始上升。说上个月5月底为止的话，美国平均薪资12个月的移动平均现在达到6.2%，那比通货膨胀率的4% 来得更高。那我们其实在去年我们就预估，那就说美国的那 CPI 的年增率，就名目 CPI 年增率，大概在第3季的话就会降到4% 以下。那第4季的话会降到3%，那没想到是比我们的预估稍微早了1个月左右。那所以说这一个物价下降的趋势是，那就大概是可以确定的。但是服务类价格的粘滞性的话，会使得 Fed 它不敢那轻易的那就说松口，那就说那停止升息，否则的话很可能不小心就前功尽弃。所以说那可能7月还会再升1码，最后1码的话就目前来讲还不是那么清楚。
这当中，我想在问顾先生之前我还是请我们李董事长来谈一个问题，就是说，银行现在大家，以前是中国的铺钱不会越高越好，现在如果你越高你就麻烦了。这个麻烦，我想以现在的情势来讲，台湾的银行业到目前为止的体质，这个李董事长来跟我们说明一下。
我想做银行做金融，我们其实呢，应该要先围绕在这一个 real economy， 就实体经济为主。供应链谈的不再只是成本，跟这一个效率谈的更重要的是一个安全的问题。因此，这一个开始有一个转变。这转变呢，从银行的角度，我们是 follow 我们的客户，所以特别呢，我们是 follow 所谓的有根的国际化的一个策略。就是说是一个以台湾为基础的一个跨国性企业，这也是我们这多年来在推动的一个观念。而这一些呢，从过去这7年来看，基本上这一些台资这些以台湾为基地的跨国企业呢，已经开始改变了。正如刚刚提到说，这个中低附加价值往东南亚走，这中高附加值回到台湾。这一些呢，当然都引发这一个银行开始也跟着流动。除此之外呢，金融本身的风险，这个曝险，让我们也必须要做这个调整。那我记得在这一个2016年底那时候，我们台湾对中国曝险金融的曝险超过60%，就占银行总净值的60%。而直到今天呢，大家一起努力，无论是从实体经济的移转到这个金融 financial sector 自己的一个自律的调整，已经降到大概25%，减半以上。而这一个公股银行减得更快，到现在剩18%。那台湾银行减更快，我刚回来接的时候是48%，现在呢，我们的中国曝险剩下5.8%，零头不到。所以这就是整个的这个趋势。那我想一方面呢，跟实体经济挂钩，支持台商全球布局，走向理性的全球化。另外一个呢是金融体系自己的一个自省风险的管控。我想做以上的这个报告说明，谢谢。
李正仪要不要再补充一下？我想从地缘政治、有岸外包的供应链的移转的角度。你从经济学家的角度看未来世界的变化。
那实际上，其实这几个刚刚社长讲的这几个国家，其实我们觉得这个将来在有岸外包里面其实都扮演非常重要的角色。而且这里面其实不是每个国家是独立的，它其实有些国家是互相有非常紧密连接。我举个例子比如说波兰。那波兰其实是一个非常困顿的国家，在历史上其实非常辛苦那也因为这样子呢，其实波兰在很早期，尤其是在第2的时候呢，它其实在很早期那时候它已经灭国了它为了要复国，它其实很远方跟日本有很大联系，所以那个时候日俄战争的时候呢，日本有很多情报是流亡在欧洲的波兰军官提供的，所以波兰跟日本的关系非常非常深。所以我就讲这个其实这些有岸这几个点你现在看其实是一个点，它以后会串起来变成一个面这是很重要的。如果今天乌克兰真的重建，波兰当然是最重要的，但是我跟各位讲，波兰是第1名，谁是第2名？日本一定是第2名， 因为日本这些五大商社跟波兰的关系是大家没有办法想象的，所以我说这个友岸外交呢，其实是未来很大一个投资的亮点，大家要密切的注意。
好，剩下时间就给我们辜先生了哈。这个一方面，今年是世界巨大变化的一个重要的转折点。那你往后看，这个世界会出现哪一些新的变化跟调整？第二个，在日本啊，我刚才在讲，你在日本那么多年啊，这一次，那日元到底要贬到什么样的价位才合理啊？对日本有帮助。第三个，每一年你回来都会对台湾提出一些对台湾的看法，你可以详细来回答，好不好
？Let me start with Japan because that's the one that I think answer quite quickly. There was a period where Europeans and Americans enjoy bashing Japan because they were so completely overtaken by the Japanese in the 80s and 90s. So many of their industries were wiped out because Japanese products were so much better, so much more reliable. So there was this, I won't say hatred, but this feeling that how could Japanese beat us? So when Japan started losing its momentum because of the balance sheet recession, even though I was trying to tell people around the world, including people at the Federal Reserve, that what Japan is going through is something that anyone can go through. It has nothing to do with Japanese-ness of the problem. But no one wanted to hear that. They said, Japanese, something wrong with Japan. Something wrong with the Japanese people. And that's why the economy is suffering. And they have to be like us, Westerners, so that they can come out of it. So they talked about structural reform, the lack of structural reform in Japan, and therefore Japan is bad. And because these people control the media, global media, whether it's Bloomberg or CNN or the, BBC or whatever, so everybody else gets to hear the same story. And everybody somehow get the same idea that, Japan is kind of finished, unless they really become like the West. But sitting in Japan, and as I indicated to you in my presentation, it was quite amazing that after 87% decline in asset values, the GDP is still maintained. Unemployment rate never went higher than 5.5%, even though Japanese people lost wealth equivalent to 3 years' worth of 1989 GDP. The amount of wealth Americans lost during the Great Depression was 1 year's worth of 1929 GDP. The amount of wealth Japanese lost was three years' worth of 1989 GDP. So 3 times the damage. And still the GDP was never below the peak of the bubble. Unemployment never higher than 5.5%. Streets are still safe. People are still courteous. Everything is still working. So I thought that was Japan at its best. That even under such difficult circumstances, people are still doing everything that they're supposed to do. Society did not collapse. Crime rate did not skyrocket. And so I kept on telling people that, well, in some areas, Japan did fall behind because the companies have to use their money to repair their balance sheets. But there's still a lot of things that are perfectly good in Japan. But all these investors did not want to hear it. They were happy believing this Washington consensus or whatever you call it, that Japan is finished. That's already history. Warren Buffett lost $22 billion last year. So I guess Warren Buffett said to himself, well, if I could lose $22 billion believing this one, then maybe he can make more money doing the opposite. So he started talking about Japan, and suddenly everybody started paying attention to Japan. But for those of us sitting in Japan, they says, what has changed? It was always very good. It's difficult to even convince my wife that we should leave Japan. She's sitting somewhere over there. Because it's so comfortable, so safe, everything works so well, water is still drinkable, air is very clean, Every time you go to a shop, you get very nice service, no matter who you look like or how. That's difficult to get in any country, including here. So that's why so many of you like to travel to Japan, right? Because you're treated like kings and queens in any shop that you walk into. Whereas that's not always the case here. It's even worse over there in China somewhere. So to me, it's a kind of surprise why Japan suddenly got all this attention. But one reason why it attracted so much attention is because the yen has fallen so much. With the yen falling so much, all these investors around the world were saying, wow, all these calculations, but with such weaker yen, it makes more sense to invest in Japan. So that actually was one of the key catalysts. People pay more attention to Japan because now things are so much more cheaper, whether it's shares or real estate or whatever. But I am not very happy with the situation myself because I don't think Japan should be doing that. Japan should be maintaining highly accommodative monetary policy under those circumstances. Because the inflation in Japan we see are all imported inflations. Food prices have gone up quite substantially, energy prices and others too. So Japanese people are not feeling rich at all. In fact, they're feeling poor, much poorer, because compared to the income, the prices have gone up quite a bit. But Bank of Japan kept on keeping this very accommodative monetary policy. And my concern as an economist, maybe I'm too worried about it, is that if United States have that many problems trying to come out of quantitative easing, and that's what I was describing to you earlier, that coming out of, try to normalize monetary policy after quantitative easing is a very difficult, very expensive process. I say expensive because I skipped that one line in the presentation. Federal Reserve today has to pay $150 billion every year to the banks because the $3 trillion that they have with the Federal Reserve have to pay interest on it. Now with 5% interest rate on $3 trillion, that's $150 billion each year. The $150 billion that the Federal Reserve paid to the bankers will increase federal budget deficit by $150 billion. How do you explain to the average Americans that our budget deficit, the taxpayers' cost went up by $150 billion so that bankers will not lend money to the private sector in the United States? Try explaining that to the average people in America. Most people will say, what's wrong with the Fed? How did we gone into this mess? We have to pay $150 billion each year to the bankers so that the bankers won't lend money to us. This debate hasn't happened in US yet, but I'm sure some Republican or whoever will start pointing this out and say, how come we have to pay $150 billion a year to these rich fat bankers for taking zero risk, and then we, the taxpayers, have to suffer? Now, if it's $150 billion in Japan, United States, how much would that be in Japan? The amount of excess reserves in the banking system in Japan is over 520 trillion yen. That's almost the size of Japan's GDP. It's 7 times larger than in the United States. So if Bank of Japan has to tighten monetary policy at some point, or normalize monetary policy, that's the kind of 520 trillion is the base that they have to start normalizing. And so the task of normalizing is going to be much more difficult, much more risky than in the US case. And the US is already having so many banks failing and so many commercial real estate prices falling. There are a lot of risks in the US market already from this Federal Reserve raising interest rates to over 5%. if the same thing happens in Japan, it'll be a million times worse. So I've been trying to tell political leaders in Japan, some within the Bank of Japan, that if US problem you thought was bad, the Japanese problem is going to get even worse. So why don't you normalize monetary policy as soon as possible? Especially now, when yen is so weak. This is a chance for Bank of Japan to normalize monetary policy. Because if the yen is weak and you try to normalize, chances are high that many foreign investors will come to Japan because they know that the yen will be appreciating. So you want to be there early. So when they come in, what do they buy? They buy Japanese government bonds. And if they buy Japanese government bonds, even if the Federal Bank of Japan is tightening, because the foreigners are buying bonds, long-term interest rates might not go up. And that will be the best scenario for Japan to normalize monetary policy. Well, they haven't done that yet. I wish they do, because I think this is the right time to normalize monetary policy in Japan. So everything in Japan I'm very happy with, except the monetary policy. I think this monetary policy is doing more harm to Japan than good. Of course, for Taiwanese traveling to Japan, weekend is great. And so please enjoy while it's still there. But at some point, Bank of Japan has to act. I mean, this whole idea that Japan should continue this monetary policy is based on the assumption that CPI will be falling below 2% on the second half of this year. If you read Governor Ueda's speech, May 19th or something, he said, we are still keeping our interest rates so low because prices will fall below 2% second half of this year. No one in Japan believes that. Prices are it's very high, moving higher. And so at some point, when they say, it's not going below 2%, then that will force the Bank of Japan to change. And at that point, they might have to push interest rates higher. So overall, I'm still quite happy with the way Japanese economy has progressed. But this monetary policy is something I like to see changed as soon as possible, before it's too late. In the US case, it was a little bit too late. Inflation was way ahead, and then the Federal Reserve had to do the catch-up. And because they had to do a catch-up, they had to raise it very quickly, and that caused all the other problems that we are faced with now. Unfortunately, Governor Kuroda, and Governor Ueda that we have now, both of them had no central bank experience earlier. And so if you're from the central bank, I started my career as a Federal Reserve Banker of New York as a central banker. You think about these 6 months down the road, 1 year down the road, all the time. But if you're not from that kind of training, you might just look at the current numbers and say, it's still below zero, this and that, and then you might not make all these forward planning. And I was actually very unhappy with Mr. Kuroda's actions. I was the loudest critic of Mr. Kuroda all along. And a lot of people in the financial market were on my side, but Kuroda did whatever he did. Now we have to face the cleanup. And this cleanup, 520 trillion yen of excess reserves in the banking system. I mean, if any of you can come up with a great ideas to remove this thing, I'll be happy to listen to it, because it is such a daunting task ahead. And it was not necessary, because it wasn't working anyway. You saw that one of my charts where Kuroda did this massive increase, and then the inflation rates, lending, all staying very flat, not responding to what Kuroda was doing, because we have this lack of borrower problem. But now, if the borrowers do come back, which is what we are all waiting for, this 520 trillion will have to be removed quickly. And so on the way in, it did no good. On the way out, it could do a lot of damage. And that's not the Japanese problem, of course. The US is going through that too. And Europeans are, of course, faced with the same problem as well. Taiwan. Well, I think Taiwan has done a great job. I have visited a few of the Taiwanese companies, Nomura's clients, and I'm very impressed by the sense of urgency that these Taiwanese companies, the management of these companies have. And whenever I go visit and talk about these issues, the kind of questions I get from Taiwanese companies, the managers, are really sharp questions. And I wish I got those questions when I was visiting Japanese companies, because that's the kind of sense of urgency that Taiwanese operate under. Of course, we have the kind of neighbor that we have. People have to operate that way. And I think that's one of the key forces of Taiwan, a key strength of Taiwan, that because we are under such horrendous geopolitical pressure, people have to be always aware of what's happening around the world. And that makes them a better businessman and better in so many fields. Whereas Japan, it's a very peaceful place. And so they're kind of losing all this contact with the rest of the world because in some sense they don't have to. But if I may go back to Japan on one point, I have seen a huge change in Japanese reporting on Taiwan. Until about 2 years ago, if you see one article on Taiwan in Japan's Nikkei newspaper, maybe once every 2 weeks, maybe once a week, but usually once every 2 weeks, one little news. Last year, you see an article on Taiwan, whatever the issue may be, once at least every day. Maybe 2 news every day. That's how much Japanese concern on Taiwan has grown in the last 2 years. And I think that's a very good sign because, as former Prime Minister Abe said, Taiwan problem is Japan's problem. And so Japanese are becoming a lot more aware of what's happening here and a lot more concerned about what's happening here. But then also tell me what's going to happen to the next election here. Because they're very concerned that if it goes to wrong hands, whatever that may be, everything could be all screwed up. So those are big changes on the Japanese side toward Taiwan. That everyone is talking about Taiwan. Everybody is hearing about Taiwan every day. A huge change that I haven't seen for last 40 years, but it's now happening. But coming back to Taiwan, Taiwanese companies are now borrowing money, as you saw in one of the charts. And so if that companies are borrowing money and investing in a lot of assets, then government should kind of remove themselves so as not to raise interest rates or cause crowding out problems. But if we get into a situation where companies are not borrowing money, more cautious, then those are the times the government has to come in and borrow more. And it would be good if Taiwanese government will start preparing what are the good infrastructure or other projects. It could be education, it could be this, it could be energy. But you should have a list of those things first. So when the need arises, you say, okay, number one, let's use money on this one. Number two, oh, this one. Instead of suddenly you realize that the situation is pretty bad and you have to do fiscal stimulus and you're trying to find the projects, then you often end up with a pretty lousy one and not well thought of, and then you end up wasting a lot of money and a lot of time. So as a precautionary measure, I would recommend Taiwanese government, or any government for that matter, to always have certain number of projects well studied, vetted, so that when the need arises, they can go onto those projects, realize them right away, so that we don't waste time as the economy might be losing steam. And I would like to see if we can make the water drinkable in Taiwan. Maybe I said this earlier in earlier sessions, but I was told that during the Japanese times, water was drinkable. But after that, no one maintained it, and therefore the water became undrinkable. But if water becomes drinkable, then I think it will add so much to the image of Taiwan and to the public health. And Taiwan's health system is one of the best in the world in terms of helping average people. I'm sure there will be a lot of people, I don't know whether this is a good idea at this juncture, but I'm sure many people in the mainland would love to come to get a health treatment in Taiwan. And if the water is drinkable, that will be even, it will really show them that, look, Taiwan is well ahead. In those areas that may not add directly to the economic growth and development, but will it raise the living standard, the real living standard of the people if water is fully drinkable, and that adds to a new set of business, especially with people coming from abroad. I think those are the areas where I think Taiwan can do some more from the government side.